Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant psychiatrist based in private practice in Harley Street, London. And welcome to my radio program, Shrinking the World. I'm delighted to be joined today by Gwendoline Smith. Gwendoline is a very eminent clinical psychologist based in New Zealand and the author of several best-selling, incredibly well-selling books to do with psychology and psychiatry and mental health, best-selling books around the world. I'm going to be talking about her first book, The Book of Knowing. So Gwendoline, many thanks for joining us on the program and welcome to the show. I'm going to ask you maybe a tough question to begin with. You're clearly a qualified psychologist, a clinical psychologist, and it's clear from reading your book that you're coming from a background of academic study and actual clinical practice. We both know, because we're both practitioners in the field, that many people write self-help books or guides to mental health who are not qualified and who don't see patients. It seems to me from reading your book and the examples you've given that it comes through the fact that you actually see patients and you've studied the subject. Do you think it makes a difference in terms of the kind of quality of book that people might read in the self-help genre? What are your thoughts?
First of all, nice to meet you too, Raj. It's a delight to be here. I'm certainly aware of the phenomena that you're talking about. And I think that there's a couple of classifications. One is people go through what they call their quote unquote journey and decide to share a cathartic experience with the world in the hope that that will also help other people. I'm not being nihilistic. I think sometimes that sort of literature can inspire people, but it's not evidence-based, it's not scientific, and so therefore I don't know how long the impact of that sort of influence from a writer, how long the benefit is for the reader. Upon saying that, I think you'll agree that a lot of our colleagues in mental health, the books are often so textbook, so heavy, so laden with scientific jargon that they're inaccessible for the reader that you're actually trying to help in the first place.
So you just mentioned a couple of words that seem to me to be very important to you, something that's evidence-based and something that's scientific. Why is that so important to you? Why does that matter?
It matters to me because if you are using a certain method, whether it be psychoanalysis, whether it be Gestalt, whether it be cognitive behavioral therapy, I think as a clinician, it's reassuring to know that what you're teaching and what you're offering a person has been shown to be effective across large groups in the population.
And I think the very important point to make here is a lot of things sound very attractive. There are lots of different schools of psychotherapy. They sound very attractive, but the reality is when they're subjected to scientific testing, they often prove to be useless, no better than giving people a placebo. And I think a lot of patients and the lay public don't realize that. They don't realize there are a lot of what we might call snake oil salesmen out there peddling stuff, which looks attractive and looks like it offers a magic cure. But in fact, things that survive scientific testing in psychology are few and far between. Very little in psychology, and I'm interested in your reaction to some of these provocative points, very little in psychology survives scientific testing. So people aren't aware of that, I think, as much as they should be.
I think that's a really good point, and a very brief anecdote on the, I guess you could say, part of the demise of psychoanalysis was that when the cognitive behavioral therapists, when that school came through and they could say, yes, well, here we have social phobia, here we have obsessive compulsive disorder, here we have simple phobias, and guess what? We can look at having this issue resolved and having this person back on the road within 6 to 8, in a longer term relationship, perhaps 12 sessions. And of course, that's going to be and was very attractive to insurance companies, because with the Freudian analysts, you're talking 5 days a week for 3 to 5 years. With a Jungian analyst, you're talking 3 times a week for 3 to 5 years. And that's a large amount of money for insurance companies. This applies primarily, of course, in the United States. When I first came across cognitive therapy, I thought to myself, okay, this is a bit superficial. This is a bit, let's just deal with the symptoms, and I'm sure the insurance companies are very attracted to it for those very reasons. So I was a bit of a skeptic when I first started learning and eventually practicing cognitive therapy. But honestly, Raj, because I've been around for a while and I've practiced a lot of different modalities, and I really, really am fond of this one because I see it working. And particularly, it's fabulous to watch it with young people. And of course, the Book of Knowing was always primarily geared towards youth.
So let's talk a little bit about this notion of cognitive behavioral therapy. People hear this term a lot. I think actually it's lost meaning to some extent because it's wheeled out as a kind of universal panacea. And many people claim to be practicing cognitive behavioral therapy, but they're not necessarily really doing the real thing, right? And one of the things that's interesting about it, and people find this very surprising because it runs against the kind of Hollywood version of psychotherapy, is a cognitive behavioral therapist will not be likely to be discussing your childhood, will not be likely to be interested in your dreams, for example, will tend to be very much focused in the here and now. What did you do yesterday? Etc., etc. And also will take a view that by being in the here and now, people can get better remarkably fast. But the other thing that happens in CBT, and I'm interested in your opinion on this, it's quite an argumentative therapy. You're kind of challenging the patient, and the patient may be surprised and may be expecting what we might call tea and sympathy. They may be expecting kindness and sympathy, and the patient may believe that complaining about their lives is the treatment, whereas cognitive behavioral therapy says, stop complaining and let's do something about the predicament you find yourselves in. So there's many things about CBT that will come as a surprise to many patients and will be found to be quite difficult. I mean, do you agree, for example, it's quite an argumentative therapy?
It doesn't have to be. I mean, I think that what you and I both know is that the results are quite clear that 50% of the effectiveness of a psychotherapeutic intervention is the rapport that you establish. You know, that's it. So if someone likes you and likes what you're saying, then you're halfway there. As snake oil as that may sound, it's actually true. So cognitive behavioral therapy has also branched out a bit too, because having come from a psychodynamic background, God, all these words are confusing for you listeners. You know, we were schooled in that go backwards, go backwards. Now, how I round that off for people is I say, look, there is no prerequisite here that we've got to start when you were born or prior to you being born and work from there. Most of my patients are relieved. I said, but so you just start where you got stuck, where you need a bit of a helping hand from me. We'll start there. If that includes your childhood, so be it. And of course, the schema therapy taken from schematics, the bones of the core beliefs. If I've got someone who's really damaged from a very dysfunctional childhood or an abusive childhood, I will often use schema therapy, which looks at the primary beliefs that were created as a result of living in terror as a child. So it doesn't completely, Raj, discount the importance of childhood shaping. I mean, you and I both know, just for the listeners, the thing we talk about now in our industry is epigenetics. When I started training, it was a battle between you lot, the psychiatrists, and us lot, the psychologists. Well, who owns the cure? Who owns the cure? Is it nature? Is it nurture? And this battle went on, of course, for decades. But really, the answer is not either or. The answer is both. And we call that epigenetics. So I think that as the cognitive science has evolved, it has taken in, it's incorporated a lot more from the other disciplines and is not quite as float the surface as I think it might have been seen to be. But when I have patients and they say, and I will say to them, can you tell me about what sort of therapy you've done in the past so I don't have to reinvent the wheel and you don't get bored? And they say, yeah, well, I've had CBT and I thought that was useless. But then when you ask them about what it was, what the essence of what they were doing was, it was someone that had possibly done a 6-week course in cognitive therapy training on Dr. Google.
Right. Okay. So let's go to the beginning of your book, and you start in a very interesting and unexpected place, which is you start with Socrates, ancient Greek philosopher, lived around 300 BC, and you have a lovely quote from him: "I cannot teach anybody anything; I can only make them think." So, why do you start with Socrates? Why is he so important to you?
I've got a soft spot for Socrates because I really like his concept of the guided discovery. And what people don't realize is that Socratic dialogue, which I've got a few examples here, Socratic dialogue is the backbone of law. So like a prosecution and a defense, so, and how did you know that was my client that you saw coming out of the window at 3 o'clock in the morning? Facts, facts, facts. There is no room in a court case for, oh, well, I'm not quite sure. Well, yeah, I just sort of felt that it was him. And looking at him now, I'm sort of, yeah. Same vibe as that guy that came out of a window with an AKA at 3 o'clock in the morning. So Socrates exists in law, and the cognitive therapists also picked up the Socratic questioning, because what you don't want, if you're really, really, focused on helping people, you don't want to be swimming in generalized misery. So in other words, they sit down, you say, and how can I help you? What seems to be the problem? Everything. How are you feeling? Terrible. Is there any time where you might be feeling more terrible than other times? No, all the time. So what do you do with that? What do you do with that, Raj? Not much. So one of the things that that the cognitive bunch, they have got little sections. We won't go into them all, but the ones I use the most would be clarifying questions. So what you're doing is, let's define the problem, because
In
then,
more detail.
that's it.
Yeah.
Because then once it's defined, you're on the road. Because whereas previously you're getting this general, just everything's hopeless, but when you go in with well, could you give me an example of when you feel worse? Or what do you mean when you say I'm unhappy all the time? And so by using questioning, the brain needs to go and look for some evidence. And you see people like the neurolinguistic people, you know, they did a lot of stuff with eye movements. Where's the eyes going? Is it going backwards? Is it going forwards, etc.? But I always notice when I ask people a question, they sort of look up and they go looking for something specific that you can then work with. So that's what I really enjoy, is that you get people, it's a little bit mean, you know, I mean, in response to some of the comments you made earlier, it could be seen as a teeny weeny bit of bullying, in that people may have an expectation that they're just going to come in and sort of vomit out all these problems and it's going to be fixed. So when you do so, well, how does that work when you do that? What would that look like? What outcome are you hoping for when you do that? You are boxing them a little bit, but it's much more valuable in terms of progress.
Well, you've put very well something that I think very few therapists put as well as you just done, which is the power of the intelligent question, which is very powerful indeed, right? And asking a great question helps people think. But at the heart of the Socratic idea is also the idea that the person who is answering the question has to do some work. They're going to have to think. A really great question makes you think and challenges your fundamental belief. So here we arrive at another problem. You've got to arrive at therapy willing to do the work, and it's quite tough work. Is it not the case that one of the problems with CBT is it's not going to work with people who aren't willing to do the requisite intellectual work, which is required in response to a great, provocative and challenging question?
Where my mind goes, Raj, with that very intelligent question, I might add at this point, is that it's not for everybody. I see picking a therapist as like buying a pair of shoes. You don't walk out with the first pair that you can fit on your feet, you know, and then you're halfway down Oxford Street and of course, you know, your feet are throbbing and you're having to stop and breathe because they're too tight, but they looked amazing, you know. So I say to clients, look, because you see the other thing, and I'm not divulging my age, but the other thing when you get to my age, yes, I am 66, all the sixes, that's a bingo thing, isn't it, Raj, that you do in the UK? All the sixes, 66. One more and you've got the devil. So I will say to them at the end of the first hour, because I'll give them an intro. I always give an intro. I said, look, I'm very eclectic. That comes with age. Let's just see how we go with this. If you don't groove with this, if it doesn't resonate for you, let me know. You know, I'm not going to take it personally if I'm not your style. So I always give them the opportunity at the end of the first session to leave and not come back. I think I've had that happen once or twice in my career without being too egocentric. But I think just like, again, it's the rapport, Raj, it's the match, it's the fit, you know, that gets you. And then if I want to drift off into a bit of transactional analysis because it seems like, yeah, this would really help in their family dynamic communications, off I'll go, you know, because even though cognitive therapy has a protocol, week 1, you're looking at this, and week 2, which I used to find quite offensive, but I don't now. I always say again, when the person gets there, I'll say, how's your week been? Tears, grab for the tissues, shit. I said, well, look, let's talk about this distress that you've got today. I said, we're always going to have stuff to return to, like a thought diary. We can always return to the agenda. But what's most important in these sessions is you. So if something is a priority for you, it's the priority for this session. And we can always return to the other stuff later.
But the other bit that's hard work for many people with CBT is the idea that they like to locate the source of the problem in the world out there. It's the bullying boss I have, or the fact my boyfriend has left me, that explains why I'm upset and despairing. What CBT says, yes, the bullying boss may be an important event and your boyfriend leaving you may be an important event, but it's the coping response you're mounting. It's the way you're thinking about these things that's really the key bit that's landing you in trouble. So it shifts the locus of the problem away from the world out there to some extent to within you and your response to the world. And that shift of locus means people are starting to take responsibility for their emotional responses. And that's a thing a lot of people don't want to do. They don't want to take responsibility for the idea that I'm in trouble because of something I'm doing to myself. What are your thoughts about that idea?
Let's just take the bullying boss. When it comes to the bullying boss, I will have a look around, a bit of an X-ray picture using some of the scales that we use, particularly the Burns attitude scales, really helpful in this area. So I'll have a bit of a skim around and I'll just have a bit of a look at the thinking. And if the thinking is in reasonably good shape, and we then start talking about the environment, because the cognitive model, biology, mood, behavior, cognition, in my books, I always draw that inside a circle, like most cognitive people do. So the circle around the outside is the environment. And so sometimes you just go straight to the environment and say, tell me about this person. And if it's really looking like the individual is working with some cluster B narcissistic sociopath in a big job, and there isn't any other way, there isn't a going up the food chain, there isn't going to HR because it's all going to cause too many problems. I mean, it's interesting, Raj, that in the employment law work that I do, people, when they're really, really distressed, they've got a good case, they go to the employment lawyer, and the employment lawyer will say, yes, but let me tell you about the trauma of laying this complaint. Do you think you're going to have the resilience to get through the other side? Because it's going to be ugly. Because the corporation that you're working for, they've got a bank of lawyers. You've been traumatized by working in this environment for 2 years with a bully. Very little resilience, probably depressed, minimally burned out. So then I will say, maybe it's time to leave. Maybe it's time to change the environment. So I never ignore that stuff, although, of course, the cognitive scientists will say, it's how you're thinking and responding. It's not the environment. Reality just is. You can't change the world. Well, yeah, I mean, if you do happen to detect that the thinking is very unhelpful, very dysfunctional, everything's being personalized, everything's being catastrophized, then I'll work with people within that context. And no big surprise, I've had a number of clients who have stayed in the job and are quite happy in the job because they're thinking about the job differently.
Well, I agree with you that if you can't stay and it's an impossible situation, you should leave. But let me just pick that little analogy or that example. So If you keep staying with the bullying boss and the bullying boss is impossible to deal with, but you keep staying and you don't leave, because I agree we would call that problem solving. That's a good problem solving solution when the environment is untenable to stay with. But a lot of people stay. So let's take another example. A woman comes to see her doctor and her husband has assaulted her the previous night and beaten her up. And obviously that's utterly reprehensible. And at that moment, philosophically speaking, the location of the problem is the husband shouldn't have done what he did, right? But if we move forward 5 years forward into the future, and every day for the last 5 years that woman's been beaten up, the location of responsibility begins to shift. The man's still terrible, he shouldn't be doing that, but the fact she chooses to stay, right, in the face of that, and we both know there are many reasons why people do that, the location of responsibility begins to shift a little bit towards the fact that it's her decision to stay that's also partly landing her in trouble, without in any sense trying to excuse the man. So isn't that one of the issues? When you propose problem-solving actions that people should perform, they often don't perform them and they stay, but they still want the magic third solution, which is take the problem away without me having to perform this action I don't want to perform of leaving. And when I stay, I keep complaining to you that I can't cope. Does that not often happen in the human predicament?
Yes, it does. What do I do with that personally? Because clearly, as a therapist, you would be mirroring that back. That's right. So in December of 2012, just after you'd got out of A&E with a broken jaw, you did mention that, you'd had enough and you can't stand it and you might leave. So here we are in 2020. So what has gone on in there that keeps you there? And they'll come up with all the stuff they come up with. Then, if I'm at my wit's end, I will say, look, sometimes I'm a believer in readiness. All the old motivational interviewing stuff, Raj, with contemplation, pre-contemplation, etc. And I'll say, look, I'm a great believer in readiness and I'm not judging you. I'm always quick to point out, I'm not your judge here. But perhaps regardless of how other people would perceive the relationship, perhaps you're just not ready to leave right now. So why don't we leave it here for now, because let's not do the broken record. Let's leave it here for now. And if you get to a point where you're ready, where the line in the sand has been crossed, give me a call.
Now, you see, I think that's a very interesting technique that's slightly manipulative. I'm not saying it's the wrong thing to do. I'm just saying it's manipulative because you're kind of saying, listen, I'd like to be here and support you, but if you won't do the sensible thing, I can't stay and work with you. You're using some psychological pressure there, I would say. I'm not saying it's the wrong thing to do. I just think there's a lot of psychology involved in what you've just said.
Yeah. Also, I don't know what it's like in the UK, but private clinicians are expensive here. There's no insurance cover. And I guess, British working class, I'm sort of aware of people's budgets, and I will say to her, look, this is a big use of your resource. Are you sure you want to put, this amount of money every week into something where clearly you're not ready to leave just yet? Because particularly since COVID, money's definitely not growing on trees in the economy over here at the moment. People are very aware of how they spend their funds. And so I always just say, I don't say leave, I just say, look, just thinking, do you have the resource to keep seeing me, given that we seem to be going over the same ground?
So another move that now happens in this chess game that often is therapy is one of the things you refer to in the book, which might be referred to as awfulizing, where people say, I'm too distressed, I'm too upset to perform the action that you keep telling me that I need to perform. So let's talk a bit about that, because I think this is a very widespread cultural problem. And people think therapy is about venting and expressing emotions. And the phrase that I would use is they're often worshipping at the altar of emotion. And CBT is saying, let's use intellectual override. Let's use our brains, let's use our intellect to think about the problem. And strong emotion is no more, no less than strong emotion. It's not something that will kill you, and you can be in control of it. This relationship that people have with strong emotion is a tough one, because CBT is saying you don't have to be a boat on a storm-tossed ocean of emotion. But many people believe they are and are very reluctant to let go of the idea that emotion controls their lives, and they are unable. They often say this: I don't understand how you can tell me that I can learn to be less anxious or less upset, that I can through just thinking about it differently or performing certain actions, the emotion will be controlled, that I can develop control over the emotion. Generally speaking, the more widespread cultural belief is emotions control us. Again, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, the cognitive theorists would say feelings are not facts. David Byrne's got some lovely stuff about how, the emotions are the mirror reflection of our thoughts. I won't dig it out because it takes too long. But we also culturally, particularly if you look at two of the people I loathe most in the world, which is the Kardashian sisters, everything, I can't even say it now, mainly because I'm an atheist, but oh my God! God! Overdid that joke. Broken fingernail. It's a broken fingernail. It's on Instagram. They've got a rush. Oh no, they wouldn't rush. They just go into the nail salon in their mansion, get it fixed. Then they can put that on Instagram, and then the world is good. So this sort of catastrophizing, or awfulizing, as you called it, is being taught to younger people. And there's a little technique that we use, that I've used in all the books, is the decatastrophizing. And it's perspective. Like, I don't say to people, you're going to come out of this like Spock from Star Trek. You will have no emotions about anything ever again. And that's what we've achieved the goal. I say to them, on a units of distress scale of 0 to 100, how well do you manage life when you're bouncing around at 80%, 95% out of 100 units of distress? Not well. Okay. Well, how about we just do a little technique here, and we don't get rid of the emotions, because yes, you are sad. Yes, you are frustrated. Yes, these things have validity for you, but let's try and pull them back so that you can go to work in the morning instead of staying in bed because it's all too much. And the little scale that I use is a terribleness scale. Again, a little bit mean, but effective. So we'll go back to the broken fingernail. Or this is a very common one. Young female meets young male. They hook up at a nightclub. This is in knowing, I think. They meet up at a nightclub and decide to keep in contact. And he doesn't text. And that's it. Life's come to an end. So up on the board, up on my trusty whiteboard, I have 0 to 100. And I'll say, so how distressed did you feel when you sort of got the clue that he wasn't going to text by 9 o'clock the following morning. Just kidding. By lunchtime. So, look, I don't know, 98 as they look at the scale. And I say, okay, well, look, let's stick that up on the board, 98, no text from random. And then I'll say, okay, look, just want you to imagine this for a moment. So you leave the therapy session, the phone rings, your phone goes off, and it's Dad, and he says, look, I'm going to have to meet you up at the hospital. Your mother and sister have been involved in a head-on collision with a truck, and they're both in ICU on life support. And they go, oh, that'd be 150. I said, no. You've got to stay in that 0 to 100. It'd be 100. Well, they're not dead. They're on life support. You know, they haven't actually died. Well, it'll be 99. I said, well, let's make it 99.9, you know, just for argument's sake. And then, of course, they see the scale. And so then I'll say, okay, so here's no text from a random at 98. Here's mum and your sister on life support. Oh, only 1.9% difference there. And depending on the baseline levels of anxiety that you're working with, but they'll look at it. I said, so if I was to give you your time again, where would the text from the random guy be? Oh, I don't know, 15? You know, and sometimes if they're quite emotionally dependent little creatures, sometimes you'll only get them down to 60, but you've still shifted them 39 points.
Yeah.
And I'll say, so does that feel a little bit more manageable? Yes, it does. And then they'll use that little technique. They love it, that one.
So right there, I mean, and a lot of what I love about our conversation is a lot of your style, and clearly you're a great therapist, is coming through. And one of the parts of your style, besides your dry sense of humor, is and the fact I would find you slightly terrifying, because I'd be worried about being about being irrational in the face of your fearsome rationality. But what comes through is you tell wonderful
Don't
stories.
forget though, Raj, I'm on a lot more psychiatric medication than I bet you are. I can be rational on the cyclone as long as I've got my lithium in my back pocket.
See, there you go. Again, you have a great sense of humor, but you tell great stories, right? So let's talk about storytelling, because I think it's a deep part of what therapy is about. And I don't think it gets taught nearly as much as it maybe ought to be. So I think let's go back to the psychoanalysts. And I think one of the things about psychoanalysis, whether the science found it to be effective or not, they told great stories. You see, you came in and said, listen, I hate my boss. He's bullying me. And the psychoanalyst nodded sagely and listened to your story. And then right at the end, he said, well, you do realize what this really means is you fancy your boss. And you thought, what? And there was always sex and violence, right? So there was always a cliffhanger at the end of the therapy session, and you had to come back for more because it was just an amazing cliffhanger, you know, where the opposite of what you thought was true. The psychoanalyst said, you know, well, what this dream really means is, and it was really something quite horrendously. So they told great stories, okay? And when you look at the Freudian canon, Freud didn't do clinical trials. He just wrote up the case histories, and they were fantastic stories. He was a great storyteller. So there's something very attractive about that. And is that one of the flaws with CBT, is that it's a bit dry, not the way you practice it, but the way other people practice it. It's just about logic and disputation. But there's something about storytelling that I think lies at the heart of what great therapy is. Stories engage people, and it changes the way they think about things more powerfully than logic and disputation does. What are your thoughts about that?
I tell the old story, but I'm more of a fan, and I've read quite a bit of this stuff, Raj, actually, just on Google in passing, trying to find StreamYard. So is the metaphor. I love a metaphor. And metaphors, I'll tell you do you want to hear my newest metaphor?
Of course.
I'd only designed it about 3 or 4 months ago. So
please trademark it, though.
Yeah. So we're talking about negative mind chatter. This is the overthinking conversation. So, and for some people, of course, that dialogue, although it's not like voices in a schizophrenic spectrum, it's still this negative self-talk that just haunts them every waking hour. So for a while, I was sort of using, sort of like the clever stuff, like the Socratic dialogue, how's this thinking helping me, all that sort of stuff. And sometimes they were just too soft for some people. They're just too soft. So I paint this metaphor. Okay, imagine yourself at a barbecue in England when it's not raining. So, you want to be specific about that. So you're at a barbecue and the host brings over a bowl of new potatoes smothered in mint and butter. Beautiful. Then buzz, over comes a fly. And so you sort of reach out and you go, shh, shh, and you get rid of the fly. So you return to your conversation and out comes the salad with a beautiful vinaigrette, just fabulous, no carrots. And so there it is. There's the salad and 2 flies. This is becoming testing on the frustration tolerance. So it's one big hand for people that can only hear me. Swipe! Get out! So back, relaxing, and then, much to everybody's horror, the same 2 flies come back and they're shagging. You know how disgusting that looks? You've got 2 flies glued together. At some stage, maybe post-coital, they're going to drop, splat on the table, hopefully not in the salad. So by this stage, people are at their wits' end. The flies are back, they're shagging, they're flying over the fucking lunch. And so that's it. So it's just up and across the table. And can you swear on this radio show?
I think you just have. Anyway, keep going.
Oh, okay. So I won't swear. But, and then you just go, F off. I say, talk to your voices like that. Tell them that. Get rid of them. They're like shagging flies. You don't want them at the barbecue. They're not guests. They're not enhancing anything. Just bully them. Get rid of them. And a lot of my clients really love that. They actually use the word, which I didn't use, and they find that really effective.
Now, you see, I think that's a great story, but embedded in the great story is great psychology, which is the thoughts are not that important. They're bothersome, but you're making them out to be much more important than they really are. Flies are irritating. Flies can spoil things, but how important are flies? It's a very good perspective-making story. So one of the things that I do, let's trade stories here a little bit, when I'm trying to get people to see that stories, that thoughts, Freudian slip there, thoughts, one of the problems with anxious people who are a bit obsessed with certain thoughts is they attach way too much importance to a thought. A thought is just a thought. It doesn't really, necessarily be as powerful. So I said, imagine you come in one day to the consultation, and halfway through the consultation, I suddenly sort of look like I'm glazed off and looking at the distance, and I suddenly say, the bank that's in the square just outside Harley Street, the one that you pass on the way here, and they go, yeah, they're wondering, where am I going with this? I said, well, I pass that bank every day, and I've been thinking, I think we could take that bank. I think it's takeable in terms of a heist. I'm just
Yeah,
saying.
yeah. Nice.
And now I said, well, so what would you think if I suddenly just introduced that slightly weird thought in the middle of the conversation of a therapy session? And most patients say, well, I think it's a bit odd, right? Then I go, yeah, but would you think I'm actually a bank robber? Would you think, oh my God, I'm not seeing him again? He's obviously got a balaclava and a shotgun, at home.
Yeah,
And they go, no. They wouldn't. They said, no, it's obviously just a thought, right? I go, right, exactly. It's just a thought. I said, suppose 10 sessions later you come in and there's a couple of balaclavas on the desk, an AK-47 on the side of the side of the room, and some detailed plans of the bank vaults on my desk. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, if I start discussing taking out the bank, what would you think now? And they go, well, yes, I do think I'd be getting a bit worried. And I say, what's changed? And they mention the fact what's changed is physical actions have occurred in the world. There's a physical reality. And I say, therefore, it's not just a thought anymore. Notice what's happened.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's not get bogged down into the rights and wrongs of the story, but we're both interested in stories as things that help to change the way people think. And I think there's a kind of creativity in therapy in that area where, again, you can't really teach that. I mean, it just comes with experience and also with a certain passion. And what comes through in your books is you're passionate about trying to change people. I'm going to say something very controversial now. Just as there are many people who turn up to drive buses who are going through the motions, they turn up at 9, they go home at 5. And although they do a perfectly competent job, they're not passionate about driving buses. I think there are many therapists who do the same thing. They turn up at 9, they go home at 5, and they're not passionate about what they do. And what's different about this work, unlike driving buses, is you have to be passionate to get people well.
Yeah.
And I think that's missing from a lot of, you just can't go through the motions, whereas most people just going through the motions. But am I being really unfair to the therapy profession?
No, because the thing about professions, which I find interesting, is a lot of the time there's a backdrop. You're at the vet, you're with your dog, getting a jab or whatever, and if you're like me, an extrovert, and you keep talking, so, how come you made up your mind to be a vet? Well, when I was 5, I had a dog just like yours, a Spoodle, and he got run over and killed. And from that moment on, I knew I wanted to be a vet. Or you'll talk to the psychiatrist. What interested you in this? I grew up with a brother with schizophrenia. I saw the impact on the family. So often when people have a backdrop, drives desire. But then some people think, oh yeah, well I'm really interested in people, and you see this a lot in the drug and alcohol field. Some people think that personal experience is enough. It's not. It's helpful, but it's not enough. And I think it's the balance of both that really molds a good clinician or helping professional, because that's the police, that's the fire service, it's the vets, the doctors, the nurses. So I agree with you, I guess is what I'm saying.
So we're running out of time a little bit. It's been fascinating talking to you, but I'm going to ask you a very unfair question now. When you have your own internal dialogue, when you have things that frustrate you and irritate you, and you have to try your best to remind yourself of certain CBT principles to stay calm in the face of extreme provocation, what are those best moments for you in terms of I've written some self-help books like you have, and there comes a close moment for me when my wife says, but how come you're not following the advice in your book? And that's always a very dangerous moment. So does that happen to you where you actually catch yourself and realize I'm not actually following the advice, I've got a bit upset here or whatever? Or have you got perfect mental health?
Excuse me while I just choke off to the side. Now, I'm aware of the time too, Raj, and it's been wonderful. And maybe, because I know we're chatting again, maybe you could throw me some curly questions about what it's like being a clinician or just a person actually with a severe bipolar disorder. Because jokes aside, the medication that I'm on doesn't really allow me to ruminate. I mean, I must admit that I do practice what I preach, but I don't get a lot of that busy chat because of the medication. And maybe next time we chat, we can spend a bit more time for the listeners, sort of like talking about the blend of what your profession uniquely contributes in terms of medication, and how we as psychologists and psychiatrists work alongside each other with the combination, because certainly the evidence now is very clear that it's not either or. Join the two together. I mean, if I have clients come to see me and they're severely clinically depressed, I won't start working with them until they've been to a medic and the mood started to lift with antidepressant.
Okay, well, yeah, I think we'll be closing very, very, very shortly. So I'm glad you mentioned the fact there is medication and it can be helpful, because we often exist in silos as professions where we can be suspicious of what the other has to offer, and I think that actually there's a lot of overlap, really, and it's also often a false division between the professions. But maybe I know we're running out of time, but just ask you one last question then. Could you maybe say something about a patient that changed your practice or changed your life? A particular, obviously you have to disguise details to protect confidentiality, or a kind of patient that's had a big impact on you or changed the way you practice or the way you think about what you're doing.
When I wrote Knowing, and as I said, it was primarily geared for young people, my practice started filling up with young people because it got media. I'd never considered myself as someone who would work with young people, and then they started turning up, and then I started getting more and more exposure to what we clinically call social anxiety or social phobia, and what I refer to as the fear of being judged. And what was lovely is that, I mean, I was only talking about it the other day. I had this young student, couldn't come out of her bedroom, couldn't come out to answer the door, in and out of panic attacks or anxiety attacks 2 or 3 times a day. We did primarily a cognitive approach with the thought diaries and so on. And by the time we'd finished her therapy, she was, out and about, going to university, flatting. Her mother was delighted. And she, one of our local, national magazines called The Listener, which is a sort of, I don't know what your equivalent over there is, but it's a slightly more serious magazine that looks at social issues. And she, Raj, ended up on the cover.
Which is the most extreme form of exposure, you could say,
of
social anxiety, where you're frightened of other people seeing you at all.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So that's about the power of personal transformation. So you're a strong believer in the human spirit, that people can change and do amazing things, because that's also very important. And I think many people who've done therapy for a while get ground down by it, and they get very cynical. I mean, Freud famously said people are basically trash, suggesting that he may have been suffering from a bit of burnout, really, towards the end.
Or a bit too much cocaine, Raj.
But what about that thought? That how do you keep your positive attitude to the human spirit, given how positive you are about it?
Sometimes when I watch the news, particularly if I watch anything that's emanating out of America, I said to someone the other day, I really love people, I love working with people, but, sometimes I really hate human beings. The climate, the greed, the corruption, the power, the torture, the war, that stuff. But yet, as soon as one person comes into my office, I love people, but I get a very short fuse when it comes to the nature of the beast in terms of humanity. Not all of us, but enough of us to really make it pretty ugly at times.
And so you began to see young people, and that was something to do with one of your first books. You obviously also believe that CBT is something you don't actually have to go to a therapist for. You can do it yourself. You can train yourself through your books, for example, to deliver the therapy yourself. Because the reality is there are too few very good therapists to go around, and that squaring that circle of the vast iceberg of mental health problems that are out there, given how few therapists, does mean inevitably there has to be self-help. And often there are terrible apps that are out there that offer that. But ultimately, is that one of the reasons you wrote the book, to try to get the ideas out there, given you as a therapist can't see everyone?
Yes, not everyone can afford private care. The public system's overloaded. Some people live in remote areas where they just don't have access. And so in the books we're going to be talking about, I've set it up like, you're in a therapy room with the therapist, and I have a conversation as if you're there, and it works for people. I mean, I get a lot of emails of people, your book, it's changed my life. Thank you so much. I've never met them, probably never will. I think since COVID, I think we probably all are doing a lot more online virtual sessions, and they work really well because the client can have the book there. If I'm trying to make a point, I'll say, okay, look, go to that picture on page 206. This is what we're talking about. This is what I want to teach you. So they work in that format as an online workbook. But I think it is ideal if you can have face-to-face therapy, but we're sort of living in a world now where that's just not always possible for financial reasons, for COVID reasons, for locational reasons.
Okay, so we're running out of time. Just to run over, the book we've been talking about today is The Book of Knowing by Gwendoline Smith. We hope to be talking about two of the other great books of hers, The Book of Overthinking and The Book of Angst. Is there, in the short time we've got left, a quick guide as to which kind of people should be reading which kind of book? Could you say something a bit about that in terms of which problems
Book of
related?
Knowing is geared towards youth. It's quite ageless, but all our little stories that we were talking about, Raj, are about text messaging, or they're about the Kardashians, or they're about broken fingernails. So although they're universal examples, they're geared towards youth. Now, the Book of Overthinking is that's the one that's really been most successful. I decided, and it's for anybody who worries. But as an author, you would know you don't call something the Book of Worry and expect people to read it on the commute with everybody else looking at it, particularly if they've got social phobia. So I called it Overthinking because I'd have 30-somethings come into the office and I'd say, so do you think you worry? Because, of course, as you know, we call that generalized anxiety disorder. They say no. I say, okay. And they'll say, but Mum does. Mum worries. I don't. Perhaps overthink. Would that apply to you? Oh, yes. That's totally me. So that's why it's got such wide scope, because it's for people of all generations. And I've called it, to catchphrase it, worrisome overthinking. The Book of Angst, although I do a sort of Lonely Planet guide to the bulk of the anxiety disorders, just to show people what they are, that book is primarily geared towards people with a fear of judgment, or as we call it, social anxiety.
Well, we talked a little bit about psychoanalysis, leave things on a cliffhanger. In this few seconds we've got left, I'm going to leave this with a cliffhanger. There is some research evidence that women, compared to men, are more prone to rumination. And men are more likely to come home and watch Sky Sports 3 and not ruminate. Whereas women, having a stronger sense of responsibility, tend to ruminate more. So maybe we'll talk about that gender difference next time we talk. But it's been lovely talking to you, Gwendoline. We're out of time.
You too, Raj.
Thank you very much. Speak to you soon.